So one last possibility of market failure, which is probably the most common type of market failure, is when price is larger than marginal cost, right? And we saw this in Chapter 7, where limited competition, when firms have some market power, when they're facing a downward sloping demand curve, allows them to set price above marginal cost. Or there could be this case in which there is a decreasing long run average cost curve due to a natural monopoly. And so in those industries, there's some large fixed cost, a really low marginal cost, and so the average cost is decreasing over the whole range of production. And so this is a market failure because the allocation is not Pareto efficient, right? There's some deadweight loss that um, we could normalize somehow, that we could get rid of by setting price equal to marginal cost. Um, Now, someone like Joseph Schumpeter said, this isn't necessarily a real market failure, right? Because if you take the long run view, then it could be that, when there are these prices above marginal cost, that provides an incentive for other firms to come into the market, and eventually those will be competed away because it will, and actually there's a benefit there because that provides incentives for firms to enter that market and do something better than the firm that is earning those positive economic profits. So I think there's a fine line when you're talking about things like competition policy, through like the Department of Justice or the Federal Trade Commission, is you want to um, encourage competition, but you don't necessarily want to eliminate all economic profit because you want to provide incentives for firms to enter a market. But this is probably the most common, technical market failure because, we end up with prices above marginal cost. So then that kind of leads us to the last question of Chapter 12, which is, should markets allocate everything? And a lot of times the answer is obviously just no. So one is obviously we don't want some repugnant markets, right? So we don't want slavery. We probably don't want a market where you could sell your vote. We probably don't want markets, in anything that we think should be illegal. Think about, drug dealing. There are some arguments for making drug use legal, probably, but selling drugs to people does seem like a potentially repugnant market, especially if it's a drug that is really dangerous. Other institutions might be more effective in how things are allocated. So that could be, government, whether that's local government, state government, federal government. It could be families. It could be neighborhood organizations. There are a lot of other possible institutions, and that might allow us to get to a more effective outcome, even if it might not be as efficient sometimes. Market mechanisms might crowd out norms of social preferences. So, one argument that's often made against capitalism is that it turns everything into a market when that's really not what we want. And so, it turns, relationships into market transactions, which might be bad. And then might be some things that we just want to make sure that everybody has, right? So we might want to make sure that everybody has a good primary education, secondary education, even tertiary education. We might want to make sure that everyone has enough food to eat. We might want to make sure that everyone has a house or at least a roof over their head. And so there could be goods that we don't want the market to distribute because they will distribute them in such a way that not everybody gets them. So just in terms of summary, there are lots of sources of market failure. One is externalities, right? So whether that's a negative externality or a positive externality. One is asymmetric information, leading to moral hazard or adverse selection. And one is limited competition. We also talked about public goods. And so possible solutions, one could be regulation, one could be bargaining, one could be taxation, compensation, right? We're all trying to move the marginal revenue equal to the social marginal cost rather than the private marginal cost. And if we think about markets for other types of goods, we want to think about, public goods versus public bads. Do we want to subsidize some things, tax or even ban other things? And then we want to think about the limits to markets, right? Are there some things in society that we don't want to leave up to the market, that we would rather distribute in another way? And there may be for, certain types of goods like public education, like food, like health insurance, etc.